Hello! Welcome to Webtoon Genius. This is where we talk about all things related to webtoons on any platform. From discussions on themes and content to interviews with webtoon artists. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Hall, and today I'm joined by the webtoon author Trevor Mueller, who this year launched two separate webtoons, Nexus Point and Re-Possessed, on the platform Webtoons Original. Come and join us for an exploration into webtoons. Hello, Trevor. Welcome to Webtoon Genius.
Yeah, thank you for having me on your first episode. I am so excited and humbled to be invited on that. So thank you.
Me too. I'm also very excited to launch this podcast. I've been wanting to do this for years. Anyways, for those who might not be aware of your work, why don't you tell us a little about yourself and how you got started making webtoons?
Sure. So I actually started making comic books professionally back in 2009. And primarily doing webcomics. So back before Webtoon and vertical scroll comics were a thing, was just doing kind of single page uploads through through webcomic pages, comics press kind of templates, and some of them going through community pages that existed at the time, like Drunk Duck, which was owned at the time by Platinum Studios. If you're not familiar, Platinum Studios' claim to fame were the Men in Black movies and the less popular Cowboys versus Aliens. So then that was it. Like that was what they kind of did. And similar to, I think, a lot of publishers out there, they were kind of mining some of the titles on there for IP so that they could turn them into Hollywood movies, which was new at the time. But so I started off on the web kind of there with several different series. I did a sci-fi samurai comic called The Temple of a Thousand Tears because I was, very insightful and very deep, and, it was college. So I needed to have something that I could point to and be like, hello, I write this thing that's very meaningful. But it was also a really good learning experience, but a very terrible story. And that allowed me to kind of snowball into doing like gag strip kind of format comics, some short form stories. And then I got into self-publishing. And so I've kind of jumbled back and forth between self-publishing and webcomics. And so these webtoons are actually a return to webcomics for me after an absence of about 3 or 4 years. So that's been pretty exciting. And Webtoon's something that I've been wanting to do for several years now. And so the opportunity to do not just one series, but two at the same time was very exciting. A little scary, but also something that's just been a very rewarding experience so far.
While you are an established author, which helps a lot in opening doors, I know that it is hard to get into being a Webtoon original. So what exactly was the journey and connections that might have helped you in becoming an author of a Webtoon original?
Yeah, so the way that I got into being a Webtoon original, I've been trying to meet with Webtoon for probably like 2 years prior to actually getting on board. And I have a number of friends that have original series on there. Katie Cook's Nothing Special, Justin Jordan's Urban Animal, Tom Zoller has a number of series on there. Cupid's Arrows, I think, is his latest one. And I was trying to just meet with anyone that was there. So New York Comic Con one year, Webtoon was hosting one of the after parties, and Justin was kind enough to introduce me to his editor. And I brought, a little sampling of some of the books that I'd been selling at the show. And I said, like, here's an example of the kind of stories that I tell. I have physical copies of all of the books that I work on so that you can show them to editors, right? And hand them off to people so that they can see what kind of work that you do. And some of them are, again, for sales, and some of them are for other stuff. And, Witches of Eastwick Boulevard showed diversity. And
I purchased a few of those myself.
Right. So like it showed a diversity in storytelling. It showed a diversity of art styles and artists that I work with, and it showed the kind of stories that I could do and where I was trying to go. Having done primarily young readers series, that's where I won most of my awards, was on Albert the Alien, and trying to stem a little bit more into middle grade and young adult kind of audiences. And so the editor, I concluded that meeting with, I just want to send you ideas. Like, can I pitch you? Can I send you some? I want to develop something for Webtoon. Can I send you some ideas? And he's like, yes, absolutely. There's no commitment on his end to anything at that point. It's just contact information. And so I sent him, we had a couple of additional calls after that where I just kind of talked about, like, what are you looking for? What's kind of the long-term growth strategies of the platform? I'm a very versatile writer. So I have stories in just about any genre that I want to tell and that I can tell. Where are you guys trying to expand and concentrate? And that's where they came back to me and said, science fiction is an area of opportunity for us. We really want to grow the library that we have of content within that genre. And we also want a story that kind of appeals to more male-centric readers. Our readership tends to skew quite female. And we feel like, male readers are an untapped audience that we can potentially try to get to convert over onto the platform. And I was like, I can do both of those things, right? I love science fiction. I love genre storytelling. And I can write a story that will appeal to both male and female readers. But it doesn't have some of the elements that I think a lot of the female readers tend to gravitate towards on the platform. Like, romance is not a big part of Nexus Point. It's there, and there will be some romance stories going on within it, but it's not a focal point of the story. The characters tend to be the story, I think, tends to be a little bit more plot focused than characters' emotional focus. And so, again, those are some of the elements that we kind of intentionally put in there to meet the confines of the brief that Webtoon was kind of looking for. And again, I think we pivoted that on Repossessed quite a bit, where we did try to soften that a little bit more and make it so it was a little bit more inclusive of everyone, and work with some of the things that people really do like on Webtoon stories and incorporate those into our story in a unique way. So net, I sent probably a dozen pitches over to Webtoon after those initial calls and those meetings, and said, hey, I'm just going to send you like ideas. You tell me what you like, and you tell me what you don't like, and then I will find a creative team and I will put it together, and we'll put together like a more formal kind of pitch. And out of the dozen or so that we had on there, a couple of them I had been pursuing from a self-publishing perspective, and they really liked this fantasy idea that I had for a story. And when I told the artist about it, she kind of was like, I don't know what Webtoon is. It's not really my bread and butter. I'm a little uncomfortable with the update schedule that they have on there. I'd like to step away. And I was like, totally fine. Not a problem at all. And so that project, they were interested in, didn't happen. Then they were interested in a story that I had pitched them that I knew was a horrible fit for Webtoon, which was Demon City. It's an R-rated kind of buddy cop story. And I sent it to them really just to kind of like give myself more time to develop something that was more suitable for the platform. And naturally Webtoon came back and they're like, we love this, but we have notes. And they took all of the elements of the pitch and basically like deconstructed it and destroyed it. And they were like, we love everything about it, but everything about it. And so I kind of walked away from that one. I was like, no, that's not a story I'm interested in telling. And then we arrived at Nexus Point. And Nexus Point, I'm going to spoil something, I think, a little thematically. Nexus Point is about a relationship between Jack and Jemmy, but it's not a romantic relationship. It's a pseudo father-daughter relationship. And so they really gravitated towards that idea of found family. And found family is something that I absolutely love to write. My Albert the Alien series is all built around a foreign exchange student that comes from outer space and makes a family with his friends on Earth, right? This new group of friends that they keep going on adventures for. And that's what we're kind of doing with Nexus Point. There were a lot of comments in the first episode where they're like, I ship Jack and Jemmy. And I'm like, he's like twice her age. Like, I was like, he's like 40 something. She's like 20 something. Think Buffy Giles. Like, that's what we're going for with their character relationship and dynamic. And Nexus Point, or sorry, Webtoon absolutely loved that dynamic and that idea. Because again, nothing else was really doing kind of a father-daughter relationship in their characters. And so again, a lot of that stuff starts to kind of stem out as the story progresses. I think there's only 11 episodes up at the moment. Our characters have only just met at this point in the story. So again, it's a long burn, but it's going to be a good sell at the end. And so they really liked Nexus Point. They loved the elements that we had there. They're like, what's it going to look like? And that's where I started hunting for artists. And I found Sebastian on there and said, hey, opportunity knocks. I love your art style. Here's an opportunity that's currently on the table. I'd love to work with you. What do you think? And he's like, I'm in. So he's like, science fiction. Like, I gave him 2 ideas for like sci-fi stories. I was like, there's kind of the space opera one, and then there's the cyberpunk one. He's like, cyberpunk? I'm doing that one.
That was a great choice on the artist for Nexus Point. You truly lucked out.
Yeah. Again, he already had a bunch of cyberpunk artwork in his portfolio. And so it was not something that was new to him. It was something that was a passion point for him. So I think that really benefited. And, I sent him, again, when we did like our world Bible, I sent him like, here's like our main characters. So we need to design them. And then we'll probably need like some background looking like, bounty hunter characters and hacker characters. And suddenly he's turning in like this sheet of like 23 different character designs. And one of them was Rook, who's the bounty hunter who appears in the first episode with kind of the VR headset on. He had no name. He had no background. He was literally like bounty hunter number 3. And I was like, that design is so awesome. And this guy has to have some kind of arc in the story where he is the bully of all of the bounty hunters and he steals all of their bounties. And his name is Rook because he looks like a chess piece. And like, I just started putting all that together. So like design and art started to inspire story and characters, which I love about the comic making process. It's such a collaborative process when you do a single task on the story. Like, I just write, he just does art. We work together and we make beautiful story together. Some of the other creators that are on Webtoon Original do it all themselves. And, there's a lot of autonomy and there's a lot of freedom within that. But every time I get an email from Sebastian with a new update, it's like it's my birthday. It's a gift. Like, it's just beautiful. And I get to open up this present as I'm like clicking on links to be like, oh yes, that's what that's going to look like. Oh, he did something unique there that I never anticipated would be in that scene. Or he'd have this unique spin on the scene where the woman with purple hair kicks in the door, right? I literally wrote like, the woman kicks in the door with a lot of strength. It's like superhuman strength. And he does like this 2-3 panel shot of her like narrowing her eyes, like locking her leg back, and suddenly the door flies down the vertical scroll like 3-4 screens worth and hits the wall on the other side. And I was like, that is genius. That's not what I wrote. But that's the process of artist and writer coming together to tell the same story. And he is so good at that from a visual perspective. So when you say I lucked out, you're not kidding.
Seriously, the action panels are great, and how they flow down the screen. One of my favorite scenes was in episode number 11, and how Sebastian drew and designed the panel layout. And it just sort of moves down the screen with the explosions and the tension as Jack tries to save Jemmy. It creates exactly the type of dynamic flow that is interesting, for me at least, in webtoons, which, a lot of artists have a hard time doing.
Well, you can't do that all the time, right? You can't have every single moment be that big dramatic moment. Otherwise, the comic would just not, right? It wouldn't have any impact. It wouldn't have any agency. But the other thing I think too is just the frequency that you have to put out art on a webtoon, and especially if you're a creator who's doing it all yourself. You're doing the writing, the art, the colors, the letters, the assembly of the episodes, all of that stuff. It's a very daunting thing to do on a week-to-week basis. We've got contracted panel counts per episode that have to kind of be hit. And so you find ways to create art faster. And sometimes that's a simplification of your panel layout. Sometimes that is a repetition of art assets being used in different ways. Sometimes that's using 3D backgrounds or models to kind of build your art around. I don't like to call them shortcuts, but I can't think of a better word to kind of use. But the ingenuity that a lot of these creators have allowed them to create 8 to 10 pages worth of content every single week for 50 plus weeks. And that is daunting in terms of the amount of output that they have. So if they don't always have like these big dramatic kind of panel reveals, I'm totally fine with that. Plus, you don't want every single moment to be that. You need to build up to those kind of moments. And we had a handful of them in season 1 for Nexus Point intentionally, just again, never knowing if we're going to get a second season, never knowing how popular this could potentially be, so that we could kind of capitalize on that real estate and let ourselves kind of play, me from a writing perspective, Sebastian from an art perspective, to really enjoy, I think, working in that vertical scroll kind of format. So yeah, it's, some of it could potentially be technique. Some of it could just potentially just be frequency, right? Of art output that they have to do, or they're just really waiting for those big reveals to kind of happen, which may be less frequent within the story. I'll never fault anyone for that. Yeah.
As you mentioned, you have lots of experience in various different comic formats. So I'm curious, what differences have you seen between making webcomics or even paper comics in comparison to making webtoons?
Yeah, so Webtoons was a really exciting opportunity for me because the laurels and the crutches that you can fall back on for print comics don't exist there. There are a couple of unwritten rules that I tend to gravitate towards when it comes to print comics. Every page turn has to end on like a cliffhanger or a question or something to get people to kind of turn the page. Scenes usually last 1, 2, or 4 pages because, again, it's on that page turn that a scene will usually end and you'll cut to something else. And those are just kind of, I think, crutches that I've created for myself within the print comic world. And none of those techniques apply within the vertical scroll. And so it was, how do you try to create different pacing, different panel layouts, different gutter spaces, so that as people are kind of scrolling through this experience, you're keeping them engaged and keeping them going all the way to the end of the story. As a writer, my job in print comics is to get people to turn that page till the end of the book. That's the goal. For Webtoons, it's getting people to scroll from the top of the comic to the bottom of the comic. And yes, the art definitely plays a very significant role in keeping and catching that attention from the reader. But again, I have to have engaging characters. I have to have a compelling story. I have to have cliffhangers that keep you invested in coming back, not only to the bottom of the page, or sorry, the bottom of the screen, but also coming back week to week, because that's the update schedule that we maintain. So the structure is quite different. I will say that format-wise, from like a script format, I've never had a looser kind of script format than I have for Webtoon, because there's a lot of new techniques as well that you can do. A lot of Webtoons, and my own included, have a lot of activity happening between panels, as an example. Whereas gutter space in a print comic is usually fairly minimum, if non-existent whatsoever. The space in between panels on a vertical scroll is canvas. It's absolutely available for art, or for transition, or for sound effects, or for other elements to kind of take in and continue that story as you continue to scroll down. Thinking about the format of a vertical phone as well, a lot of your panels tend to be either square or rectangular. You can't really do like horizontal based wide shots like you can in comics. And so it's a little bit less of a cinematic look and feel and more of kind of a handheld look and feel. And how do you kind of take advantage of that so that you come up with very dynamic kind of events, structures, story reveals in there. So it's been a unique kind of challenge. And I did several months worth of research into just reading webtoons that were out there to see what were other people doing, what did I like, what did I think could have been done differently, or how would I put my spin on a particular approach, and how do I kind of capitalize on that within the confines of the story that I'm trying to tell. And so that was really the approach that we kind of took to it. Was, we had maybe a 2-3 month discovery window where I was just learning how to do vertical scroll storytelling. And then it was, how am I going to start to apply these into the episode structure that we have and keep some of those cool elements coming back in over and over again. So very, very long answer to a short question. Very, very different kind of structure that you have between print and webtoon. And the vertical scroll canvas is just a very fun place for me to play, and one that I find to be very invigorating and very energizing, because I feel like I've gotten too comfortable in some of the techniques that I do in print comics. And that's not to say that I've capped out in terms of print comics. It just wasn't as challenging to me as it had been in the past. And I like a good challenge. I like something kind of new and fresh and different. And so, again, Webtoons was just a very unique opportunity to do that, to flex some new muscles, if you will, from a storytelling perspective.
I think it was interesting when you were talking about the difference between the vertical scroll and horizontal paneling and how that can lead to the cinematic feel. However, I'm not exactly sure if I completely agree that the cinematic feel is limited to just the horizontal panel. So one of the things that has been cited in relations to readers' experience in viewing webtoons is how they feel it's more like watching a movie or a television show. This is primarily because webtoon artists often draw the sequential frames so that one or perhaps two of the images are generally shown in succession, like in a reel of a movie. But unlike a movie where it is rapidly scrolling before your eyes, you're just slowly scrolling through. But I do have to agree that webtoons can be rather limiting when it comes to vertical panels. Though I have seen this done well, with the assumption that the reader will just turn their phone to see it in the vertical format. Of course, it doesn't do so well if you're on a computer, where that is harder to do. In many ways, I think Webtoons encapsulates the idea of Scott McCloud's infinite canvas, but only in the sense of infinite verticality, but I guess it is somewhat limited horizontally.
Well, you can. I mean, there's nothing that says that as an original, they want us to hit certain dimensions that fit into the phone screen size, but there's nothing that says that you can't have people swipe horizontally while they're reading. You can also have interaction within webcomics, not necessarily within Webtoon, but within webcomics, you can have panels that are links that lead to a different story. So you can do nonlinear storytelling. You can do deeper dives into particular elements of the world or the characters, especially when you're using your own web page to do that kind of storytelling. Within Webtoon as well, two additional elements that it has that are very unique is the ability to put in GIFs and animation, and the ability to include sound or music. And so this can create a much more immersive experience for the readers, because you can actually see emotion happen in real time as you do on the screen with film or animation. And you can also include sounds, and more often than not, it's music, to invoke emotion within particular moments of your story or within particular characters as they appear within your story. So from a storytelling perspective, it does offer a lot of flexibility and a lot of unique opportunities that other platforms do not, and that other mediums can't, because next to impossible to put animation into a printed page, as far as I am aware at this time. So it's how do you potentially translate some of those? And I'm always thinking about, even though we develop the stories that I work on for Webtoon and the vertical scroll, we're always thinking about, well, how would this translate to a printed page if we were to ever collect this into a book? Because at the end of the day, I love holding something in my hand, and it's not just my phone. So,
it's also a good source of revenue too.
Yeah, I mean, it gives you something to sell at the conventions, and it gives people who are too young to own a phone and a device an opportunity to consume your story as well. And with Webtoon, some of them can get pretty young adult in terms of content that's on there. You'll see some F-bombs get dropped every now and then. I think even Repossessed goes a little bit more mature than some of the other stories that I've kind of done. Whereas like Nexus Point, we try to keep it very TVPG. It's a very dark kind of story that we have there in a very colorful kind of cyberpunk world. But at the same time, we're trying to imply, not necessarily show, when it comes to some of those darker elements that do happen in the story or have happened to some of the characters.
So you mentioned music, and that was one of the things that really impressed me. To give you a little bit of background on how I read it for the first time. So the first time I read it, I was on my phone and I was having the sound turned off like I usually do. So I was scrolling through and it was like, wow, this is pretty good. And then I realized afterwards that I was supposed to have the sound on. So then I turned on the sound and started scrolling through again. Hold on, you need to hear this part. Let's rewind a bit. I truly felt like I was reading through a movie. Now, this brings me back to that point I made earlier about how webtoons tend to give you that feeling as though it is scrolling through a movie. So adding that element of sound, as you can see, it really feels like watching the open sequence of an action movie, except nothing else could really describe it except perhaps, I don't know, chef's kiss. Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, the music was something that we kind of fell into because that's not my background at all. But I go to a lot of conventions. I've been doing comics for a very long time, well over 10 years. And having been a guest of honor at numerous conventions around the country, you start to meet people. And I have become friends with most of the original cast of Power Rangers, like have their cell phones in my phone, like friends with them. And I was having dinner with Johnny Young Bosch at a convention a couple of years ago and told him about these projects that I was kind of working on. And Johnny, during the pandemic, decided that he was, he started off on Power Rangers. He became a very prolific anime voice actor. He's been in some of the biggest anime productions of all time. The redub of Akira, Bleach, so many other ones. I mean, I was having breakfast with him at New York Comic Con talking about the Transformers video game. And he was like, oh, I was Bumblebee in that. I was like, dude, what haven't you been in? But so Johnny and I were having dinner at this convention, and he was telling me some of the stuff that he'd been working on. I was telling him about these webtoons that I was working on, and he really gravitated towards this cyberpunk story of Nexus Point. And he's like, dude, I want to do something with that. Can I do something with that? Like, what can I do? Like, I'm an actor. I do voice. Like, what can I do? And I was like, well, we're going to be putting some promotional stuff together. Like, do you want to help me make a trailer and, maybe do some voice acting for it? He's like, yes. He's like, also, he loves doing music. Dude's had 2 bands that I'm aware of, I Shine and Where Giants Fall. And they're available to stream on Spotify. He's got several albums under I Shine. And so he makes his own music. And he's like, can I make music for this? I was like, yeah, like we can put music into episodes. And I'm thinking he's going to put together like a little like 10, 30-second ditty, right? Like just a little something that's just kind of cool. Dude goes all out and makes a 6.5 minute track that is just awesome and epic. And I remember getting his first pass through of it, and my jaw just hit the floor, and it hasn't come back up since. I've just been so widely impressed with what he did. And then when he did the work on the trailer for it as well, where he does the narrative voiceover of it, and suddenly we've got a bunch of his colleagues reaching out and being like, is this a thing? Like, is this an animated thing? Can I do voice work for this? We had one of his buddies from Akira reach out to me. I think his name is Joshua. And he's like, I've retired from anime voice acting, but I want to come back and do it for this project. And I was like, what? Like, so it's been a really cool experience. Um,
Oh, are we going to get an anime out of this?
I would love an anime out of this. Hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Hollywood. That decision is not entirely up to me. And I've been in the Hollywood system before, and it can be a bit of a grueling experience at times. I would not be opposed to it. I think that it would be fantastic for animation, and I think it would be something that's kind of unique within the space, because the only other cyberpunk series that you really have going on right now is the 2077 video game, which does have an anime counterpart that's coming out, I think, to Netflix later this year. So there's not a lot of competition in terms of cyberpunk kind of genre storytelling, at least in terms of the stuff that I've been seeing. So, yeah.
Yes, you are absolutely correct when it comes to the webtoons. Sci-fi, and especially cyberpunk, is not quite so prevalent. Most of the time, if you find sci-fi, it tends to be pretty much gaming or leveling RPG ones, where someone is, trapped in a video game or in a video game-like setting and somehow navigates through this. Or their life becomes a video game. These type of webtoons. So how'd you do
I
it?
mean, I had a bit of a unique experience, because when I finally had my meetings with Webtoon and I was talking about wanting to pitch them ideas, they told me that they had initiatives as well, and they really wanted to grow their sci-fi library. And they really wanted a story that was unlike anything else that they had had on platform. And that was interesting, because I did read some of their most popular sci-fi stories that they had out there, and a lot of them are mishmash of genre, right? So it's like one of them is kind of like supernatural sci-fi, one of them is like romance sci-fi. Some of them are spacefaring kind of space opera sci-fi, which that one's kind of a combination of titles that I'm also very interested in exploring myself. But there wasn't a lot of like cyberpunk. There wasn't a lot of like action sci-fi. And there wasn't anything that had the kind of story that I wanted to tell within there. So again, I thought that it was fun. It was unique. It was a challenge both to Webtoon and myself to do something quite different. And again, hopefully we've knocked it out of the park, but we're only months in, so we shall see. Yeah, we just launched in July, and again, within the first week, we were the number one sci-fi series on Webtoon. I think we've since dropped down into top 15. So I think we're hovering somewhere in between 10 and 13 at the moment. So again, the response to it has been wonderful. The comments are 100% positive, which is great. I've got an artist on there that was one of the artists for Fortnite. And then we've got the music from a former Power Ranger on there. So
I agree. The artistry is absolutely gorgeous. Now, I remember when I was reading through it first, my initial response was, this looks like Ian Flux, but with a lot more color. Though, it does have elements that are dark like Ian Flux, because when push comes to shove, Nexus Point is, cyberpunk genre, which tends to follow that dystopian-like settings. So what I guess I'm saying is hats off to the artist, Sebastian, as well as the colorist.
thank you. Yes, Sebastian's work is stunning. And he really owned a lot of the world building. He and I spent a lot of time at the beginning just talking about what is this world like? Because we wanted to develop a cyberpunk world where nothing is really tangible, everything is kind of virtual. And that's a unique challenge from a visual perspective. You look at a lot of modern science fiction, say the remake of Battlestar Galactica, where they really tried to pare down the technology to make it very, very touchable. So like all their radios and stuff aren't handheld mobile devices like in Star Trek. Like it's a corded phone that plugs into the wall, because they really tried to ground it in naval kind of look and feel, even though it's in space. And that gave it a very tactical and I think very realistic kind of look to it. Ours is, near future kind of, we've moved from a handheld environment into a hands-free environment of technology. And so we'll have questions all the time like, well, they're going to a karaoke bar in this episode. What does a karaoke bar look like in a world where nothing is really touchable? Would somebody have speakers? Would somebody hold a microphone? Would it be a holographic microphone, right, where they're just simulating the movements of holding a mic? Or would they be like wirelessly jacked into the speaker system? So like we go through a lot of these conversations on world building, and then what does the visual element of that kind of look like? And again, Sebastian just crushes it when it comes to translating those into a very unique kind of look and feel.
Speaking of a unique look and feel, your concept of a futuristic nightclub reminds me of this experience I had on a cruise where they had what was called a silent disco. Basically, they provided headphones and tapped you into a network where everyone listened to the same music simultaneously and danced but there was like no sound or anything else going on around. And then, like you would find in a traditional nightclub. Since this was done in the middle of a lobby, anyone could pass through the space and observe people dancing and having conversations about the shared music that only they could hear and no one else could unless they were provided the headsets. It was quite surreal. So I imagine that this would be what a nightclub would be like in Nexus Point, where the characters are tapped into each other and can have entire conversations in their heads with others without anyone in the room noticing. So music in a nightclub might just be piped into everyone's head within the room and within this sort of designated area. And then they would, dance, and they would be like in a regular nightclub. So it opens many realms of possibility.
Yeah, it's fun because we're, if everything is in the eyes of the person who's connected to the internet in the story, and I, as an outside observer, can't see what they're looking at, it literally looks like somebody staring off into space and just kind of like moving stuff that isn't there. When we were coming up with the look and feel for it, there was an anime series back in the 90s that I absolutely loved called Tenchi Muyo. And there's a character on there who has basically an invisible laptop that just kind of pops up and she starts typing on it. And I was like, let's do something like that, but let's modernize it. So it's like Tony Stark's helmet, but you're not wearing a helmet. So it's all touchable, it's all movable, and your eyes can probably do most of it anyway. But that gives us a visual to show to the reader that these people are connected to the internet or they're doing something virtually. But to the average person walking around, like it would just look like somebody was just like grabbing at stuff that wasn't really there, right? So it's been fun to kind of translate that into visuals. And again, I think it does give us a bit of a unique look and feel compared to certainly other series on Webtoon, but I think also just to other things that I've seen in the cyberpunk genre before, which tend to gravitate more towards that Battlestar Galactica kind of tactical world where things are very touchable. And in this world, things are very virtual.
Speaking of worlds, I know that as an author, you are very much into ideas and concepts centered around world building. So I would like to ask, when you're creating a world, how much do you lay out to begin with? And how much is more in that sort of organic process? The reason I'm asking is that webtoons are done in that episodic form that are published every week with comments, as you know. And it can lend to some authors to being more malleable in the story making process with potentially audience feedback influencing them. Therefore, I would like to ask how you navigate story building as a webtoon author.
It's tricky because, and I don't know that this is for every series, but for my series, uh, just like any kind of traditional publisher, because Webtoon's paying me for a story, they want to know how the story's going to end before they give it the green light. And so we have to include, and I had to include for my series, like here were kind of the characters, here was the pitch and kind of the overall story. Once we got the green light on that, we went into a series outline. So episode by episode, like what kind of happens in the story that gets us from point A to point B to point C at the end. And so that element of the story is pretty locked in terms of the major story beats that are happening. There are some flexes that we have built into the story depending on whether or not we would get a green light for a second season, as an example. So how much do we have to reveal about characters or plot in a single season? If we didn't get the green light for a second season, right, like we kind of want to wrap everything up into a nice bow by the end of season one, versus do we have the opportunity to go into a second season? I call this an exit strategy. So if I need to know when that exit strategy kind of kicks in based on the performance of the story, so that I can make sure that I am pacing my character moments and my story beats appropriately, so that we are either, again, not revealing too much if we're going to get a longer story, or making sure that I fit in all of the answers to the questions that we raise in the story by the end. And we did that for both Nexus Point and for Repossessed. In terms of the world building element, Nexus Point did have a world Bible that we built up, and it was very high level because I wanted to have different looks for elements within the cyberpunk world. And we divided up kind of by classism. So the hyper rich and elite, their world kind of looks like an Apple store. The middle class kind of looks more so like a traditional 1970s cyberpunk aesthetic. And then the lower class, it looks like, a lot of the piping and wiring that you see in elements of like Ghost in the Shell. But it's not, we're trying to come up with different visual kind of distinctivenesses there. And then we also have within the various classes jobs that are going on within there as well. And so like, what do the bounty hunters kind of look like? And the bounty hunters are in a very dangerous profession. So they have a lot of cybernetic limbs on their bodies. The hackers are very virtual. And so they tend to be very lean, limber kind of characters because they're not necessarily engaging with the world physically so much as they are virtually in the stuff that they do. We've got the police officers in there who tend to dress like very hoity-toity and very, nice suits kind of thing. And then we've got the corporate people, and the corporate people, of course, look, stellar because they're wearing the finest in attire and clothing that they can. And what does jewelry look like in the future so that you can show off your status within this world? And these are all just background elements. Like none of this comes into the story so much, but we have plans to kind of meet or go to locations that flow within each of those types of classes. And we've got characters that represent across the spectrum of, the hyper rich, the middle class, and the lower class within our story, so that we can have very unique kind of visual looks and designs, I think, for the locations and the characters. With Repossessed, we did not go into this level of detail. So Repossessed was much more, because it takes place in kind of a modern world. We didn't need to do too much outside of just kind of build the rules for possession and how that works, and then come up with a list of objects that I think would be really kind of fun and interesting to see be possessed. So in the first episode of Repossessed, for example, we have a toilet that's trying to kill people. And I was like, I can't remember the last time I saw a toilet with like teeth and tongue and like floating around trying to eat somebody. I know it's been done before, but can we do something kind of fun and unique and kind of cool with it? Because I was trying to tap into kind of the 1970s, 1980s classic horror movies that at the time were taking themselves very seriously, but today we would consider to be quite campy and silly. And how do we embrace that silliness through the lens that we have today? And so that a lot of that comes through in the objects that tend to get possessed. And some of it comes through in the attitudes of our characters towards possessed objects, right? Oh, that thing can't hurt me. I'll be totally fine. Oh no, it's eating my leg. You know?
I absolutely love Repossessed because, as you said, it's an homage to these classic films. For example, when I first saw the scene with the possessed toilet, my initial impression was
You can do it, be missy.
Little Shop of Horrors and Audrey 2, which was absolutely one of my favorite movies when I was younger, and I still love it. Therefore, for readers, Repossess creates that familiar story flow for those acquainted with classic horror movies and TV shows, while occasionally interrupting the narrative with an interjection of dark humor. I definitely feel this comic will have an appeal to a large audience, even if they have never seen the films or shows that it might be referencing. In addition, one of the things I found interesting about Repossessed is that it had what seemed to be that classic hero's journey story arc as described by Joseph Campbell, with that sort of nondescript, everyman type hero who then receives the call to duty for an adventure, which they, refuse at first before eventually conceding, usually due to an extraordinary event, like when Troy and Mari needed to reclaim the possessed object from the older woman. But I'm curious how much of this story intentionally follows that hero's journey story, or would you say it's more like a Scooby-Doo-like narrative with various absurd encounters with objects?
Yeah, there's definitely a character arc that Troy, the main character, is going through. He fancies himself a bit of a hero, but he comes from riches. And so he hasn't really had to do for himself as much as I think he needs to. He's a little disconnected from the world in a way that, I've not really seen before outside of like a classic college comedy like Van Wilder or something, right? Like he's just kind of floating through life with no ambition and no passion. And everyone around him is trying to tell him to care about something. And that's kind of his arc throughout the series, is how does he discover what he cares about or what's important to him and why he should give a damn about anything in a world where any object can get possessed and start chasing him down the street because it's trying to eat him. And then you've got arcs for some of the other supporting characters in there as well, because I like multi-layered, kind of multifaceted characters within there. And so again, Repossessed only been live for about a month. I think there's only 5 or 6 episodes up at the moment. We've already finished 39 episodes out of a 50 episode season. So you talk about flexibility, like it's done practically. I mean, we're more than 4/5 of the way there when it comes to the end of this story, and we've put in elements kind of anticipating, I think, what the readers are going to like and what the readers are going to gravitate towards. Some of them kind of came from a whim, and we've not included them as much as I think we'll probably need to. But again, if we get a second season, like we can more than compensate for that. Like Paul, the possessed nutcracker, that's in the most recent episode, and he works at the shop. That was a note that the editor made, where he's like, we need creepy, weird stuff kind of happening at the shop. You should have something like possessed, like be in there. And maybe it's like walking around, maybe it's hunting people. I was like, maybe it's an employee. And he's like, ah. And so that's where Paul came from, was we now have this possessed toy that, for reasons that will eventually be revealed, doesn't try to go on a killing spree every single minute of the day like all the other possessed objects do, but has that killer instinct and wants to kill and murder and maim, like all of the other possessed things does, but also has this passion for professional organizing and helps to kind of like figure out how these various objects that they continue to collect that are demonically possessed fit into the storage space that they have. And so I just thought that from a utility perspective, that was unique and functional to the story. And then from a character perspective was funny and unique and very on brand for the tone that we were kind of going for on there as well. So some of it is a little bit flex, a little bit improv, but a lot of it is kind of locked in, at least from the major story beats that we have.
That's rather interesting, because I've always wondered how much authors have written before they go live with it, especially in sponsored materials like Webtoon originals. I know that with Canvas, creators may not have everything formed yet and can sometimes develop more organically or on a week-to-week basis. Still, for Nexus Point, how far out have you completed so far?
Yeah, so we've got the story outline through, the first season completely done and drafted. In terms of episode completion, it's not quite as far along as Repossessed. Yishan Lee, my artist on Repossessed, is just wicked fast when it comes. Like, I'll turn in a script, and within a day, she's like, the roughs are up. And I'm like, what? I was like, don't you have other projects you're working on? She's like, yes, several. And she's just a machine when it comes to art. And the quality of art that she pulls out is just incredible for the number of projects that she balances. Going back to your earlier question about like burnout and stuff, I'm like, how do you like do this? She's like, I take vacation, and during that time I do not draw. Like, that's her me time. That's what she does. But for Nexus Point, like, I didn't want to launch until we had at least 20 episodes under our belt. We were, especially at the beginning, learning how to make a vertical scroll comic. And so our turnaround time in terms of an episode was not week to week. And so it took us a lot longer to understand what the dynamics were, what the components were. We had a couple of areas where some of our team needed more time than we really could allow. And so we were a little, I wouldn't say behind, but it took us a little bit longer to kind of do some of those. So, as of right now, I think we've got 11 episodes up that are free. There's an additional 3 episodes that are up from Fast Pass. We just completed, I think, episode 25. So we may need to take like a mid-season break in there at some point, which again will help us, I think, from a pacing perspective, and give Sebastian's arm a little bit of a break, so he's not just constantly cranking out artwork. But so we're not quite as far ahead on that one in terms of the buffer of completed episodes, but in terms of story and stuff, everything's outlined and ready to go. Exit strategy on that one as well, assuming we don't get a second season, so that way we get a satisfying complete story.
That is good to hear. One thing that is always disappointing is when a webtoon, which is your favorite, doesn't get a second season and you're stuck wondering what happened. Next thing you know, you're like searching the web frantically on a vague hope that there's a web novel version, or perhaps logging onto Wattpad and even composing your own fan fiction.
Webtoon was very upfront with me about that, and I've studied the writing of various TV shows where they're trying to pitch like a multi-season story, and they've got to figure out like, how do we have exit strategies for actors. Babylon 5, right, is kind of for me the tent pole of amazing storytelling with exit strategies built into it, because they had like their main actor leave the show at the end of season 1. And they had to replace the captain of the ship for season 2 and on. And then they had other areas in there where characters and actors had to kind of exit the show too. And so studying some of the exit strategies that Straczynski kind of built into that story have been very helpful for me. And while I don't have to worry about actors and characters, it's more so like plot elements and how do I ensure that all the story beats and the mysteries that we've built up at the beginning of the story get wrapped. And thankfully, when we pitched it, all the story beats, like all the mysteries and the elements that are there, were all intended to be wrapped up by the end of the first season. It's the character beats that tend to extend out into later seasons. And so, will we be able to fit all of those into a single season? Absolutely, if we have to. If we get a second season, then I can pace those out a little bit longer, and we can kind of explore some of those characters a little bit more in depth than we would if we just have a single season.
Hopefully, you won't ever have to use an exit strategy and you get that second season. Now, right now, I can think of several types of mysteries in Nexus Point. Now, just two, just kind of off the top of my head, are Who is Sally? And another perhaps larger mystery is Jemmy's missing years. Now, I have my theories, which, could be completely obsolete by the time this podcast is aired, depending on when you have the reveal. But overall, I just really love the potential in these character backstories. And, for those of you who might not mind spoilers, what would you be willing to fill us in on upcoming developments? You can just leave it vague or say the episode if you don't want to spoil much.
So the Sally one, you'll find out who Sally is before episode 25. Yeah, you'll find out who she is. I like to do... So Nexus Point is really modeled after a political thriller. And so there are layers within each of the reveals that we have that hopefully lead to more questions. In the first episode, you've got, Jack trying to go after Pac, this hacker kid who's being chased by another bounty hunter. And at the end, it's kind of revealed like Jack maybe wasn't going to turn this kid in. Why? What's kind of the element there? And then Pac kind of sits there and begs him, like, don't take me back. I don't want to end up like the others. And Jack's like, what others? And so you've got this mystery of what's happening to hackers when they get brought in by bounty hunters. And then you've got these mysteries of character arc pieces there for Jack. Like, well, if he's a bounty hunter and he makes money by turning in hackers that have gone rogue, well, why isn't he doing that? Or what's compelling him to not do that? Or how does he make money and survive if he's not doing that and that's his job? Jack was formerly a detective working there and then decided to become a bounty hunter, which is a much less cushy position and a much more dangerous profession than what he had previously. Why did that happen? So there's all these layers that are kind of built in. And again, the story is designed to wrap them up by the end of the first season. And if we get a second season, then we can extend some of those out to last longer. But the main story is always intended to kind of be like a movie where there is a story and it all gets wrapped up by the end. We did have some comments on the early episodes where they're like, I don't understand what's going on. I'm like, it's a political thriller. So think Captain America, the Winter Soldier. If you only watched the first 5 minutes of that movie, would you understand what the total story was? No, you have to watch the whole movie, right? And so we do have some elements that are designed to be wrapped up by that final episode of the first season. So you do have to be a bit patient with some of them. I do like to kind of keep you guessing, if you will. But in terms of answers to all the questions, yes, those are all in the pitch. Those are all in the outline that we've already built up. And myself, my whole team are aware of what all of those elements and components will be. And how we will wrap it all up, again, just kind of depends on if we get a green light for a second season or if we just wrap it up in the first season, which will just make it a nice, tight, finished story.
That is great to hear, that the loose ends get resolved by the end. I've had too many experiences with webtoons that had plot threads that never got resolved or just ended abruptly. Like, for example, two recent ones that I was enjoying was the Queen of the Shadows on Tapas and My Dear Maid on Manta, which just ended without even an attempt to resolve anything. Basically, like mid-conversation. Fortunately, both of these were web novels, so I was able to track them down and find out their endings. But of course, this is impossible to do with original content that is not adaptations. So, but I guess to make a long rant short, I'm glad to see things will get wrapped up. But even better if we can get a second season.
Yes, the one thing I did not want to have happen with this, because Webtoon originals, like they encourage you quite strongly to have an ending to your story. If you don't get a second season, like make sure that you can end it and give a satisfying conclusion to the tale. I did not want this to be like Lost, where one, the answers either never come, or two, the answers were very disappointing. And so, again, I did a lot of studying of Damon Lindelof to see what to not do. But there's a lot of elements within Lost that work incredibly well. And so it's also like, how do you counterbalance kind of those types of things? Because you've got these long running mystery shows from the era when I grew up in, the 80s and 90s, like the X-Files, where the X-Files had like one central mystery that kind of ran through it until the 10th season that they filmed, right before the pandemic or whatever. And one, they never gave answers to all those questions. Two, some of the answers that they gave were not quite so satisfying and also kind of did their characters a little wrong at times. And so how do you maintain that story and those plot points without compromising the reveals and the answers that fans are patiently waiting for you to have? I like to think that all the answers that we have in Nexus Point are satisfying and hopefully unique and interesting. And then with Re-Possessed as well, like we've got elements in the very first episode of that story that people did a lot of commenting on, they think it's a throwaway joke. It's actually foreshadowing. So, and because there's only 6 episodes up, they don't know that that's actually like a story component of the character's arc that's going to be happening.
Interesting. I'm looking forward to the comments later when they start realizing that and say, oh my gosh, in episode 2, they said XYZ, or this happened and it's all connected. Actually, it's, one of the best things about reading ongoing webtoons is finding those small little elements being wrapped up later, the foreshadowing, and what you thought was a minor part becomes something quite major further down the road.
Well, there's a couple in there. I mean, I'll spoil one of them. We tried to throw something into the background of the first episode of Re-Possessed where Troy's running late to class and he's going through campus. And there's somebody else on that campus that have books kind of flying around their heads. And people are like, did Troy bump into that person and the books are falling? Or are those books possessed and they're attacking that person? It's the latter. And suddenly we are going to have a story that is around, an infestation of possessed library books.
How about the ATM as well? Now, all those people are asleep. How could they not notice there was a whole bunch of people just sleeping there? And why are they asleep?
Why are they asleep? And why does that keep happening? And that'll get wrapped up somewhere in the teens, I think, in terms of episodes. Like you'll understand what's going on there. But I think even within the next few episodes, we haven't even revealed like our major villain for the season yet. We're still just kind of establishing the characters, the working environment, and the world. But we have seen the ground that the villain has treaded upon within the first episode itself. And so that character has made themselves present without actually revealing themselves in the story. And so again, it does become a little bit of a slow burn when it comes to those reveals and those moments, but it's all one cohesive and coherent story. I mean, I've won awards for storytelling, so I like to think I know what I'm doing. But it is something, again, I think unlike other webtoons where you don't get a question and a conclusion to that question within the same episode, sometimes not even within 2 or 3 episodes. Although with Re-Possessed, we did try to keep it in like bundles of 6. So like within 6 episodes, like if we introduce something, we try to kind of like answer it or at least tell you what's going on. But there are a couple of components that, again, like this subtle little thing that we did in episode 1 that I don't think anyone really noticed what we were trying to do. Like that is going to come into play by the end of the season. And if we get a second season, it becomes another character moment that will continue through.
Awesome. I look forward to it. So, I would like to talk a little bit about episode 3 and 4 and the reclaiming of the chair that Troy sold to an older lady when they were unaware it was possessed and it starts attacking her. Then when they arrive, Troy and Mari have this like entire conversation outside of the room while it was in the background and the lady is almost being devoured by the chair. Now, I really thought it was quite funny. But I did notice several people commenting on why aren't they doing anything?
Yeah, so that was a scene that my editor and I kind of talked about for quite some time because he wanted more humor to be in the series around the possessed items. And I was totally fine with that. That's why there's a lot of sound effects in that episode of the old lady like screaming in the background like, I'm still here, I'm not dead yet. It's a little bit of a shout out to Monty Python, you know. It was what we were kind of going for with it, where she's like, if you're still out there, I'm inside, it's still eating me, help me. So we were going for that, you know. I'm not dead yet, you will be soon, like you know, we were going for Monty Python. And we needed something to be going on at that time. And so it was, again, to your point around Hero's Journey, like this was Troy's moment to kind of put up or shut up around it. And we wanted some rejection in there throughout the way. And Mari had to kind of figure out how to tap into his motivation. I mean, they're best friends. And she knows Troy better than she knows herself. And the reason why that he's like her only best friend will get revealed later on as the story progresses. But hopefully people have started to see that she's a little socially awkward and she's very direct. And so she will just call Troy out on his BS. You know, hey, look, old lady in there needs some help. Let's go do this thing. But the reason as to why Mari doesn't just go do it herself is I don't think she wants to go fight a demonic chair solo, you know. That's not really her personality. And Troy, what we're trying to kind of establish, I think, with Troy in those moments is that Troy has to find his own way to do things. It's not that he'll just go in there and start punching a thing and save the day. He's not a typical hero. He's not Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? Like when I was pitching the series, I was like, you know, it's like Xander were the main character, right? The kind of goofy sidekick character. Can we make them a compelling kind of hero character and give them a bit of an arc that makes them more heroic as time goes on, but still have that comedy bit in there where they're like, I'm not doing that, man. Like, you know. And so that was what we were kind of going for with it. And Mari becomes almost a bit of the angel on his shoulder, where she's trying to say the right thing to do is to go in there and save this person, especially since you sold the chair that's attacking her. And Troy's kind of acting as his own devil on his shoulder a bit, where he's like, I just want to go home and play video games, because he's lazy and he hasn't had to do work before. And it's only really when Mari is put into danger and turmoil that suddenly he acts, right? And Troy has a strong sense of loyalty to his friends, to the people that he likes and that he knows. He didn't know this old woman. And so he's less inclined to kind of just jump in without a little bit of a push. And this was Mari kind of pushing him off the high dive to be like, hey, there's an adventure happening and it's time to get in that pool and start swimming. So that was what we were going for. There was a balance between like the Monty Python humor, you know, no, not a good picture of my grandkids, you know, with Troy going through that hero's dilemma and Mari kind of operating as his conscience of sorts to make sure that he does the right thing.
Thanks for the clarification on that. You might have just redreamed Troy for some of the commenters.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that clarification is needed means that we didn't quite hit it, which is totally fine. Again, we'll have other elements that kind of come in later on, but it's again very much tapping into that 1970s kind of 1980s aesthetic of some of my favorite films and horror movies in particular of the time. I mean, again, we pitched Re-Possessed as like Buffy the Vampire Slayer if it were a workplace comedy. So think the end of Army of Darkness without the misogyny and without, and Troy not being, he hasn't gone through the journey that Ash has gone through, so he's not the cocky kind of hero yet. He's not there. He's Ash in the first Evil Dead movie, where he's running around and screaming, and he hasn't had his hand possessed yet or anything like that. I'm not saying that's going to happen in the story, but that happens in Evil Dead. But so none of those things have kind of happened to him yet, and he needs those moments to kind of get there. But it was that aesthetic of, the lady kind of turning possessed and attacking other customers in the store, and Ash coming out and being like, "Lady, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store." Like that kind of comedy and goofiness is what we're going for with the series.
What can I say? I love me some goofiness, especially for this huge fan of Monty Python who memorized a lot of the dialogue from the movies and shows. So, with that in mind, I think it's about time we wrap up the show. So, I would like to conclude with any thoughts you have in relations to your webtoons or new projects, which would be rather hard to do at this point since you have, Nexus Point and Re-Possessed. But if you have anything you wish to promote or wish to say as a wrap-up as we conclude this podcast, feel free to do so.
I'll say thank you for reading Nexus Point and Re-Possessed. So for anyone who hasn't read them yet, they're both available totally for free on Webtoon. Nexus Point updates every Saturday. Re-Possessed updates every Tuesday. So please give them a subscribe, give them a rating, and give them a read, preferably week to week, because that's one of the metrics that they look at to try to give us the green light for a second season, which would be lovely and wonderful. For anyone out there who's listening to the podcast because they're looking to kind of make their own webtoon and they're looking for inspiration or motivation to kind of do it, the best advice that I can give is go tell your story. It's very easy to kind of get stuck with that story in your head, and I call this the bubble bath of ideas. Stay in this very comfortable kind of realm where in your head the story is perfect. It's when you sit down and you actually start to work on it, the character designs or the writing or the season outline, that suddenly the flaws in the story start to come out. The best way to learn how to tell a story is to tell a story. You can study all you want. You can read books from other people. You can even study the works of other people. I have a giant library of comics behind me, and I don't just read them for pleasure. I read them to study technique and what the writers and the artists are doing to kind of tell their story. But you can only study so much. It's the application of that that's so critical and so important. So find a short chapter of your large epic story that you potentially want to tell, or find a short scene that you can do with some of those characters. You're going to learn so much just by sitting down and actually putting in the work to tell your story. So the challenge that I'll kind of pose to all of your listeners is, if you're looking to make a webtoon, what's stopping you? Go make it. It's free. It doesn't cost anything to kind of upload it up onto Canvas. And it gives you something that you can show off to other people, especially as you improve over time. And you will improve over time as you continue to tell your story. But it gives you something to show off to other people so that editors can approach you, or that you can approach editors and hold a copy of the book in your hand or on your phone and be like, this is the kind of work that I do, and I would really love to do something with you. So go make your story, go tell your story. That's the only way that you're going to be able to actually make it in the industry, because just having the idea in your head, that's not a story that anyone else can read. That's not a story an editor can look at. That's just an idea in your head, and it doesn't become a story until it's out there into the world. So please put it out there into the world so that we can all enjoy that story too.
I don't think I could have concluded it any better. I look forward to reading your upcoming episodes, and I would love it if you could join us after completing the season for perhaps a bit of recap and analysis of the plot and characters in Nexus Point and Re-Possessed.
I would love that. And thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure speaking with you at Emerald City. It was a pleasure, again, speaking with you here. And again, for your first episode of your podcast, I am incredibly honored and humbled. So thank you so much for that and for reading. Really, really appreciate it.
It's an honor to have you as well. And for those watching, please check out Trevor's Webtoons. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe to this channel for further content. And if you want to be notified for updates, please hit the notification button. And thank you for listening. And remember, not all artists start off as a genius, but they all have the potential to become one. Thank you, and see you in future installments of Webtoon Genius.